This is Zach from the Grip Show, and if you're interested in, grip strength, feats of strength, interviews with some of the best names in grip sport, you can go ahead and check that channel out. We got the interviews, competition recaps, even some episode specials about feats like lifting blobs and the Thomas Inch dumbbell, stuff like that. So if that interests you, go over and give that a follow. Here on this channel, it's a lot of my personal lifts, but I am getting into some of these weights in detail videos and kind of breaking down different grip training equipment. So I have done a video on the first generation Fat Man Blob, the original. I've done one on the next gen Blob, and now I'm going to actually break down the different generations of blobs, starting with the first generation Fat Man Blob. Second generation or next generation, technically there is a blue blob that goes in between here. Personally, other than just mentioning it for historical context and just saying, hey, there were blue blobs that were in here, and technically it is a thing, that would make this considered a next generation or even third generation, right? Because there was one in between. But to my knowledge, after being involved with grip sport for probably 5+ years, probably shipping 50 to 60 blobs out of state, even some out of the country and overseas, all the gyms I've been to, all the people I've met, everyone I've talked to online, I only know of 3 blue blobs that are 100% verified. That would be one at Sorinex, that's Richard Soren's, one that he had sent to Wade Gillingham, which they stripped the blue paint off of, so it was a blue blob, but they thought it was, some kind of, I don't want to say a trick, or they just thought it was, had already been repainted. They didn't realize it was the original blue paint from that generation in between. So they actually took the paint off of it. So it's a blue blob, but it wouldn't even be blue at this point. And Jed Johnson has one in his collection. Those are the only 3 I know. So outside of 3 blobs versus, like I said, the hundreds and hundreds I've seen everywhere else, thousands of people and everything, those are the only 3 that come up. So I don't have one. The 3 people or areas I named have them. And, maybe they'll do a video on them or something someday, but it's almost not worth bringing up other than just stating it is a thing, it does exist, but it is very rare. So I'm not going to, put too much emphasis on it when these are, all over and everywhere, readily available. Still somewhat rare, but, if you're in the sport or you're looking for them, still able to get your hands on them and still pretty doable to find. Whereas the blue blobs, I don't even know where you would start unless you hit up one of those 3 people and they wanted to sell it. But like I said, one out of those 3 doesn't even have the paint on it. So, and it can be tricky. I'm going to put in some of my smaller dumbbells. I have some blue dumbbells from York that are that generation, but they're like 3s up to 15s. But just so you can get an idea of the paint, I'll throw those up here on the screen so you can get an idea of what that different colored paint looks like. It's usually like a darker metallic blue, depending on where it's been stored and how the weathering is on it. Sometimes it'll become a little bit more lighter blue and chalky, but yeah, it's tough to tell once they get chalked up or once they get worn down and they're rusted up. But for right now, I'm going to focus on these here, which would be first generation, the next generation, and the first generations of legacies, which when I started Grip, they had not come out with the version 2 of these, which are much different shape and everything else. So I'm going to have some comparison pictures when we get to that portion as well. So just to start off, I have done videos on these 2 style blobs here. If you want to kind of look at those and get some more information on these specifically, I'll link the older videos or I'll pop those up on the screen so you kind of see what it looks like and you can check that out. But right now we're going to get into more of a comparison thing and kind of just break down general blob information when it comes to the generations or different styles. I have some notes here I'm going to refer to. So maybe some vintage weights collectors could correct me or, maybe comment below and edit this if it's off. But to my knowledge, the first generation, pre-USA stamp, there will not be any USA stamping on the bottom of this style of dumbbell by York. Those were kind of produced 70s and 80s. So 1970s, 1980s, I believe is when these were mainly produced. The next generation was kind of more 90s and into the early 2000s. And then these, I believe, picked up in like 2006 or so for that. And then if you were going to add in that version 2 of the legacies, I think York only recently started doing that, maybe the last year or two. So Yeah, maybe last 2 years or so, maybe those came back. But those are not that, I mean, weight is weight and the object is the object. So you could still use it for training and grip. But if you're going to try to take the version 2 legacies that are out now, they're way more narrow than the version 1s. They're more narrow and they're taller. So a lot of those aspects are going to change. So, you know, a 130 of that version compared to a 130 of the version 1 legacies is not going to be an equivalent. So it's almost a completely different category. Very similar to how these legacies are, you know, different to the roundheads. So I'm going to get into all this information and hopefully be able to map it out and break it down on the screen and give you a closer look at this stuff. But just wanted to hit those timelines. So we're looking probably 70s and 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and then, you know, post 2000. And then with a second variation that's much different coming out just the last couple years. So going from there, one of the common things you'll hear is like round heads. So for York dumbbells, the round heads only went up to 100-pound dumbbells. So the heaviest blob you would get from that would be the Fat Man. And because those dumbbells typically ran 104 to 108 pounds, cut the handle out, you know, each half a little bit over, you're looking at blobs that are about 52 to 54 pounds generally. So when we talk round heads, the first generation is going to be 52 to 54 pounds as the blob, but the whole dumbbell would have been 104 to about 108 pounds. But these are round heads, and the next generation would be considered round heads. That is going to have the lettering just like this. The lettering is going to look the same, but these are different shapes. The original Fat Man dumbbells, like I said, were a little bit bigger, and the slopes are bigger on both sides. So not only running heavy, but having a slightly different mold, making them tougher to lift. This is the original feat that Richard Soren came up with, and he's the first one to title his original blob the Blob. Everything else is technically, you know, it's a blob, or York blobs, or, you know, half dumbbells become York blobs. But that's based off Richard creating that initial feat. And a lot of other people will have like hex head dumbbells, even blob replicas. If it's strictly a blob that's made as a replica, you could pretty much count that as a blob. If it's a hex head dumbbell, generally that wouldn't really be a blob because there's nothing that's even similar to the original. It kind of falls into the category of, you know, block weight, or, you know, it's a broader thing. We could just say these are all block weights, but if you want to get specific and say what's a blob, that would be half of a York dumbbell. And that's because the original was a York dumbbell. So these two, or even the blue blob that could be in the middle, right? Those would be round heads. So if you hear somebody talk about York round heads, only went up to 100 pounds. So if you could lift the Fat Man, you didn't have a bigger blob to lift. So you would have been adding weight to this, cleaning it, finding other ways to make the feet tougher, but you did not have the ability to get to 105, 110 and bigger dumbbells. So when the legacies came out, that series of dumbbells went up to 150 pounds. So that opened up the door where, even though the shape and lettering and everything is different, and you can see that in these comparison videos, they're the pictures and videos that I'm bringing up, but you can probably see it from there, even on this screen. But this flat edge, way different here because it's so flat. It has a really big slope on this side, whereas the Fat Man slopes on both sides. The next generation is going to slope on both sides, but one side is going to be just a little bit more flat, and that makes it easier for your thumb to grab. So from there, the benefit of these, if we do just a straight comparison, all of these blobs I have up here right now, first generation, next generation, and legacy style, these are all half 100s. So the Fat Mans were kind of notorious for coming in a little bit heavy. And that's what I said, you get the 52 to 54 pound range for the blobs. For the next generation, you're looking at, you know, maybe just a hair under 50 pounds because the handle being cut out. If that dumbbell was right around 101 pounds or, you know, right at 100 pounds even, you might actually end up with a blob with that handle being cut out. It might be 49.8, 49.9, something like that, but it's really going to be close to 50 or slightly over. I have never seen a next generation on a scale and it been over 51 pounds. I've seen like 50.7, 50.6, 50.2, 49.9, in that range, basically 49.5 pounds to basically 51 and under. I've never seen one even really climb up to 51 and go that direction. So when York redid this next generation one, they did some improvements on it. They did make the handle slightly thicker. That is another way for blob identification if you really had to get down and do it. But with different generations and different things going on, it can be very tough to tell if, oh, they added a 1/16 of an inch to this handle to do that. It might, and even with the variations in the casting processes, or, hey, this decade's a little bit different than the next decade. It can be a little bit of guesswork there. But generally, all the first pre-USA dumbbells, particularly the hundreds, some of the 80s, 70s, 60s, you might not even be able to tell the difference other than the USA stamps, which would be on the next generation only. So it can be tricky to identify them, but hopefully some of the stuff I go over helps you not only identify the generation, but can kind of break down, what they weigh, or giving you this other information. If you have a blob and you can't identify it, it might make it a little bit easier. So they did increase the thickness on the handle to help with like the breakage issue of the old dumbbells bending and breaking, which is what led to this, right? So that got better, and they actually dialed in the weight better. So you didn't have 104 to 108 pound dumbbells. You probably had closer to 100 to 102 pound dumbbells if they slightly ran over. I actually have a set of next gen dumbbells over there that I did a video on, and they both come in around 101, 102 pounds. So if I were to cut those, I'm not going to, but if I were to cut them, those blobs would probably come out, in that same range I just mentioned, just above 50 pounds, but not going to hit 51. So the legacies, usually they will come in underweight. Not always, but usually. So for instance, this dumbbell head this head of a dumbbell is probably 47, 48 pounds. And I have the weights I'm going to be bringing up on the screen, as I've already weighed them out or weighed them in the past when I've lifted them. But, that's the difference here, is not only is this shape much easier in a just one-to-one comparison, right? Flat side, yes, the slope's bigger here, but this really helps your thumb a lot being flat. And then it's 47 something pounds to, basically 50 pounds with a little bit bigger slope, all the way to the Fat Man, which is over 53 pounds with a much bigger slope on the side. So even though these are all half 100s, they're completely different levels of lifting. So it's very easy to get confused if you don't know what you're looking at. So here with the Fat Man, on the bottom of these pre-USA dumbbells and blobs, you will never see a USA stamp. That's why they're often referred to as pre-USA, meaning this is before they were stamping them. The next generation is the only set of dumbbells or blobs that will have a USA stamp on the bottom, but that USA stamp will never be on the number side. So if you have a 100 on your dumbbell, there's no point in rolling it over to see if it has that stamp. It wouldn't be on there anyway. It's only on the York side. So if I were to flip these up, right, we have the Fat Man here, and there is like a casting defect on this one, but there's no USA stamp. If I were to flip this one up, let me just see. Yeah. So if I flip this one up here, trying to get it to where it's at least upright, hopefully that'll come through. If not, I'll bring up a closer image. But yeah, it has that USA stamp, only found on the York side. So if you had, a head of a York blob and someone said, hey, that's a half 100, that's a Fat Man. If you see that stamp, it's not a Fat Man. It's a next generation blob. The other way, like I mentioned, is you could put it on the scale, and if it comes in at like 49.9 or 50.2, you could pretty safely say, without any stamp or knowing any of that stuff, you could say, that's just too light to be a Fat Man. They came in heavier than that. I have seen some Fat Mans get a little bit low in that 51 point something range, but so it's not out of question, but generally the next generation is going to be right on weight, and the Fat Man will be heavy. So if you have a good scale, you can usually narrow it down right there. But if you want to know if it's that next generation, that stamp on the York side is always going to be pretty much a no-brainer, just very easy to verify. So just feel like bringing that up. That way, if anybody has questions or is trying to identify it or is looking at something online and wants to buy it, that might be able to give you a better idea of what you're getting. Or maybe if the seller doesn't even know where it came from, you might have the information to make a better purchase, or, hey, that's the one I need, or that's the one I don't need. I don't want to waste the money. There'll be no stamps on the Legacy, but it doesn't matter anyway, because you can see here, this lettering with the original lettering, I mean, they're not even close in shape. The paint's different. They're just newer. Everything's changed. So anytime you see something that looks like this with that bigger blocky lettering and not the kind of thin old school roundhead lettering, it's a Legacy. The only issue you have then, I guess, or nowadays, is it the newer Legacies or is it the older Legacies? And the newer ones even have a different lettering. And like I said, they're taller, they're more narrow. It's a totally different thing. So it wouldn't take long to figure that out if you just had a picture or got online and checked it out. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I will throw some pictures up for comparison purposes, but don't want to get too crazy on that one. So if I get into some of these other things here, I kind of just mentioned the, Fat Man being the original, feat of strength being a half 100. I would probably say the next gen Blob in comparison would be, maybe 75 to 80% of the difficulty of this, even though it is within a couple pounds, that shape difference being a little more narrow, not bowing out as much. Probably 75, maybe depending on someone's hands, 85%. And all this stuff is kind of subjective and going to be a little bit different for everyone because your hand dimensions and mobility are all going to be different. And everybody's strength in those areas is going to be different. So I'm giving rough estimates and rough ranges, but this is about 80% of this, or 75 to 85% of the original, in my opinion. And then when you get into the Legacy style, we're talking, this is almost probably the equivalent of like a pre-USA half 90, which is 45 pounds, even though it's a couple pounds heavier. This, sharp edge here really helps your thumb a lot. It's probably like a half 90 or almost a half 85 of the original style. So in comparison to the Fat Man Blob, first generation Legacy is probably 60% difficulty or something. So even though they're both half 100s, it's not even close to being the same thing. For these Blobs, I did mention that they typically come in underweight because a lot of the dumbbells are underweight. So you might have a half 100 that came from, a 100-pound dumbbell. That dumbbell might have been 98 pounds. And then you cut the handle, you lose a pound there, that's where you run into that 46, 47, 48 pounds. So even though it is a half 100, it's still underweight. It's not a true 50-pound Blob. And it's pretty much the same across the board as you go up. That is the benefit to the Legacy Blobs where, these stopped at 100. These continued up to 150. So although the 100 to 100 comparison does not match up, as we get into bigger styles of Legacies, you can actually have challenges that exceed the original pre-USA Fat Man feat. I'm going to go into this just because this is a question that gets asked a lot. So I'm going to just move this over for a second, make some space, and bring up this half 120. So I have this half 120 here. In my opinion, this half 120 right here with the Fat Man, these are about in the same range. So the Legacy Blobs are typically underweight, much easier because of the shape if you're doing like a 100 to 100 comparison. But because they go up heavier, you start getting into wider and heavier Blobs that actually outmatch this one. So in my opinion, I think that the 115 or 120, now this is a 120 right here, and you can see it's taller. You can probably see it's just bigger in general. This Blob coming in over 53 pounds. This one is actually about 5 pounds heavier. So this is like 58, close to 59 pounds. So although it is much heavier than this, which I know some people are probably thinking, a couple pounds, not that big a deal. Well, when this is like an elite feat of strength and it's 53 and then you just slap a 5-pound weight on it basically and make the width or shape change, that could be a huge difference in a lift like this where, the next pound or two is such a big thing. Whereas, if you're deadlifting or squatting, okay, 100 pounds is not really that much of a big percentage of the lift itself. Or if you start talking 10-pound PRs, that's nothing. But if you start talking about like a 1 or 2 pound increase on some of these, that could be the difference in a complete lift and not even breaking ground with some of these things. So just keeping that in perspective, you know, these weights sound similar and very close, but you know, for some of these things, as you go up in size, it could be a completely different world when you get your hands on it. So 53, 58 pounds and some change on both. But I think these two are pretty even. So if you were to take a version 1 Legacy Blob to compare it to the original feat in difficulty, like I said, still subjective. We're going off percentages, but to me, if you can lift the Fat Man, I think you should be able to lift the 120 Legacy. And if you can lift the 120 Legacy, there's not really a reason you shouldn't be able to lift the Fat Man. I think they're pretty even. With other variables like the texture or slick paint, there is a chance that maybe a 56, 57 pound half 115 might be as tough as a Fat Man that has really good texture on it and feels good, and maybe the 115 slick, it could be harder. So I say the 115 to 120 for these Legacies is very close to the Fat Man because there's a lot of other factors besides just the size and the weight. The friction with a pinch lift is always going to be a thing. So once you get into the 125s though, once you get into a half 125 and you start talking about lifting, you know, 60 to 61 pound blobs with this, you know, even wider than this 120, you're above a Fat Man at that point. So there's no doubt in my mind that a 125 is much harder to lift than a Fat Man. The 120, 115, depending on how they match up and how your hand is, probably going to be around the same ballpark. So really just kind of depends on how your hand lines up and where your strengths are. But these two are very comparable. So I just wanted to bring that up. That way, if anybody's like, well, how heavy do you have to go to match this? Or how heavy do you have to go on Legacies to outdo the original feat? My answer for outdoing the original feat would be a 125 and up, but a 120, half 120 Legacy Blob is still an amazing lift. And I would say that's right in the same ballpark, a little easier, a little harder, maybe exactly the same with the Fat Man Blob. So that just kind of helps, I guess, break down the ratio of difficulty within the Legacy to pre-USA. I'm leaving the next gen out on that because, you know, it's kind of a, you know, after the Fat Man and it's already a little bit easier. Next gen, if I was to put a number to it, I would say the next gen Blob is probably about like a 105 Legacy, maybe some light 110s, but I think the 110s are probably just a little bit harder to lift than the next gen 50 pound Blob. But I would say 105 is pretty similar. It's obviously going to have a different shape, but weight-wise and weight comparison and strength, a 105 and a next gen are pretty similar. And then I think the 115 to 120 matches up pretty nice with a Fat Man for difficulty and comparisons. One other tip I want to bring up, I'm not getting into a lot of technique. I'm not going to go super crazy with it, but with the Fat Man and next gen here, when we have these round heads, the side that is more beneficial for you to have your thumb and fingers on is going to be the same. So the cut side where that dumbbell was cut or where it was broken, that's the side you're going to want your fingers on if you're lifting that because of the shape of it. For the Legacies, as you can see here, we have the cut on the flatter side. So for Legacies, you're going to want to put your thumb on the cut side, fingers on the big slope. Now, there are feats, like I've mentioned in the other videos about the Fat Man and Next Gen, where you could do a reverse lift. If you do a reverse lift, that would just be, you know, throwing your thumb on the cut side because it has a slightly bigger slope on it, and that'll take the same blob but make it a little more difficult because it's attacking your thumb, which is always going to be the weaker, you know, portion on a blob lift because your thumb is here and it's trying to battle against your, you know, four fingers, your whole hand, and basically your wrist on that side and your thumb's out here by itself. So that's why you see a lot of people when they lift it, you know, they kind of have a little bit of a wrist flexion or a little bit of tilt. And that's just to kind of take some of that pressure and weight off of the thumb a little bit if they can maintain it. But yeah, so if you have a blob and you're doing blob lifts, if it is of the round head style, pre-USA or next generation, fingers on the cut side almost every time, that's going to be better. The only exception I can come up with to that would probably be if for some reason there was original paint still on your dumbbell and the cut side was just sandpaper gritty, and the backside where your thumb normally would be was just like smooth as glass and just slick. Maybe you would want to reverse lift it and, you know, get that optimal texture on your thumb being the weaker link. That might be the best route to lift that particular blob, but that would almost be an individual or very rare case by case basis. Generally, if the texture is even on both sides and it feels about the same, fingers on the cut side for your round head style and thumb on the cut side for the legacy style. Hopefully that clears up where to grab it, what they look like, what they're going to weigh, how to tell them apart, and just help with the overall terminology of, you know, you see people put ads up or something. Oh, it's a York Blob Legacy Next Gen Fat Man. You're like, this person, the seller doesn't even know what they got listed, right? So hopefully this will help you purchasing blobs, selling blobs, or training them and bridging the gap to other blobs, whatever you can get your hands on. I will say, just another note on the legacy style. I have ran into some dumbbells that are, you know, of the legacy version 1 model, I guess, that were heavy. So the majority of the time, probably 80 to 90% of the time, I've seen these dumbbells, they come in light, meaning the blobs will also come in light. I did have some series though, where I picked up like some 120s, 125s, and 130s one time. And 130 being, half 130 being a Blobzilla. And those dumbbells were about 132, 133. So when they were cut and that handle comes out, and the handles are pretty thick on the legacies. When that handle's cut out, those Blobzillas were right about 65 pounds perfect. So they were about, you know, legitimately with the handle removed and, you know, taking each half with what they weigh, that, you know, very high, like 64 pound range, real close to 65 or 65 on the dot almost, maybe slightly over by a couple ounces. But, so it's not out of the question if you have one of these legacies, if it is on weight or a little heavy. Just means you have something on the heavier end, which I always think is a good thing. But if it's like, oh man, I only got a 47 pound, that can't be a half 100. It totally could be, because that's exactly what this is. So generally, just know that the legacies are light, but it doesn't mean it's every single blob ever, because in these processes and over decades of making them, I'm sure there's some outliers and there's some variances. These are just, you know, general guidelines. So, yeah, hopefully that helps with some of this information. Like I said, the biggest benefit to these legacies is being able to run it up higher than the original Fat Man. You know, you got your 120s, Blobzilla 130s. You can get into like 140s, which is like the Blob Father. 150s, the Shaw Blob. There's only been 2 people that have even lifted that. So it's gets very tough once you hit that certain portion. And even for Blobzilla, there might be only 15 or so people, 15, 16 people that have ever lifted it maybe. I would say probably under 20, or maybe getting close to that 20-ish range. But yeah, I'll say 20 just to play it safe, probably 20. I'd be surprised if it was more than 20 that have lifted a Blobzilla. So yeah, I still think blobs are one of the best things for training your thumb, training pinch. Like I've said in other videos, I've gone on about the benefits of training it, so I don't want to drag this one on too long. Just wanted to give everybody a look at the weights, the styles, some of the different information regarding them, and hopefully that clears up some questions for how you're supposed to grab it, or which side to grab it. I didn't go into like specific techniques. That could be a whole nother video. But which side your fingers go on, you know, which side your thumb goes on, which generation is it, you know, how close is this one to that one, you know, or how do they rank amongst each other? Hopefully this video helps kind of, you know, categorize and clear some of that up and at least give you some general guidelines to roll with. The other thing I will say, similar to reverse lifting these, you could do the same with the legacies. It's just way more drastic with this big slope on the side. So if you wanted to really test yourself or really show off, throwing that thumb on the slope side is the way to do it for those. So if you were looking for a bigger challenge and all you have are some smaller legacies, flip them around and put your thumb on the, you know, the wider side. Same thing kind of applies for all. It's just going to be way more drastic with the legacies than this, because these round heads generally have a pretty, it's enough to notice it if you're lifting it, like, and it's kind of somewhat maximal, but if you're well above that strength level, you could grab it either way and maybe not even know the difference. But if it's something you're chasing and you're working up to, it's going to be in your best interest to do the guidelines of hand and thumb on which side that I already mentioned. So just want to keep that information out there. Want to put this out and clear everything up, and just making sure I don't forget anything. But I think that might do it for this one. So yeah, we got our round heads, pre-USA's first generation, next generations, all the weights, all those factors and everything else. And hopefully the pictures and hopefully all the video and the weights and information I'm giving you makes sense. If there's anything I left out or any questions you don't feel like I covered, you can direct message me at the Grip Show on Instagram, or just drop a comment here on YouTube and ask your question. I'm real responsive. I'll get back to you, hit you up, and let you know. So yeah, any questions, comment below, and should be it for this one. So thank you guys for tuning in and learning some more information about blobs.